My grandmother Ethel gave birth to my mum in September 1939, just as the Second World War started. My grandmother was not only a first-time mother in her 30s and also a stepmom to a 15-year-old boy, she also had to deal with rationing and feeding the family on these meagre portions was no mean feat. She also had to mend clothes and knit jumpers and make clothes for her daughter. Often there were long queues at the shops to buy things like bread, vegetables and milk. As my grandfather was a keen gardener, he actually had a vegetable garden in the back garden of their house. And they also had a chicken coop so they could get fresh eggs and have chickens when they needed extra meat. My granddad's younger brother Charlie was a bit of a spiv, and he used to get black market sausages, bacon, all kinds of things, you name it, Uncle Charlie could get it. And my grandmother and my grandfather didn't ask any questions. In 1944, just before my grandfather was invalided out of the fire service, my grandmother herself had a near miss. She was at home alone one night with my mum when a V2 rocket hit a house in a nearby road. My grandmother heard the whistling and ran upstairs and threw herself on top of my mum, who was lying on the bed. As the rocket exploded, the windows blew in and glass was lying all over my grandmother's back, and she had cuts to her back, but my mum was okay. It was this incident that prompted my grandfather to move to the Isle of Wight for a short time. The idea of living by the seaside was something that both my grandparents really enjoyed and liked. However, that trip was to be short-lived, as the job that my grandfather had over there wasn't suitable for him, as he hadn't fully recovered from his injuries, and the work was far too strenuous for a man who had a bad back. When they went back to West Ham, the place that my great-grandparents had found them to rent had also been bombed. So my mother and my grandparents ended up living with my great-grandparents in East Ham for a short time. My grandfather's sister and brother-in-law were also living there with their 3 daughters. When the war ended, there was a VE Day party at Bryan Road where my mother and grandparents lived. My poor grandmother never had a good relationship with her stepson Ron, even though he stayed at home well into adulthood. As time went on, things did get better and the rows got fewer as Ron grew up, but there was always that slight animosity between him and his stepmother. By the time my parents had had me in 1965, my grandparents had moved to the Essex coast and were living in Clacton. Ethel was always known as Little Gran to me because she was the smaller of my 2 grandmothers. She used to chat to me and loved telling me about her childhood and her life. In fact, she'd chat to anybody about her life if they'd sit and listen to her. She was a very simple, plain woman, my grandmother, but I loved her. She enjoyed her retirement down on the Essex coast with my grandfather, and I think that was some of the happiest times of her life down there when she was in her 60s and 70s, despite the fact that she had a bad hip with arthritis and she had an operation to have her hip replaced, and she always walked with a stick and a slight limp. When both my grandparents got too old and too frail to look after themselves, they had to move from their Clacton house back to Ilford in Essex to be nearer to my mother. When I was in my late teens and early 20s, my grandparents practically lived with us or lived around the corner, so I spent a lot of time with them then, asking them about their lives, and it was a really precious time to me. The stories that they told me provided the foundations for my book, and for all my family research for the last 35 years plus. And I'm so glad that whilst I was young, I took the time to sit down and talk to them and go through old family photographs and hear all of their stories, because it's so important now they're no longer here. After my grandfather died, my nan actually came to live with my mum. And about a year before she died, she actually came and spent a week with me in the flat where I lived with my husband and my children. My mum was going on holiday and my nan didn't want to go into a care home for the week, so she came to stay with me, and I'm really glad that we spent that time together. We took her out on walks to Epping Forest, and I remember sitting there at night and watching a Shirley Bassey concert with her on TV, because she absolutely loved Shirley Bassey and my granddad hated her, and so she couldn't really listen to Shirley Bassey when my granddad was around or alive, and we sat there and watched that concert together, and she really enjoyed it. And we had a few sing-alongs with some old songs, because she did like a sing-along, did my gran. My grandmother outlived my grandfather by 6 years, and she died just after her birthday in 1996. She had gone into hospital with a case of pneumonia, and sadly she just didn't make it. My mum did go in to see her the night before, and she said she was in good spirits, and it's just nice to know that when my nan passed away, she was happy the day before on her birthday. My nan didn't have a great start in life, for being the youngest in a large family with only a mother and no father. And it must have been terribly hard losing a brother in the First World War and seeing other brothers and brother-in-laws coming home injured. My grandmother worked very hard in the factories in the East End before meeting my grandfather and getting married. And being a stepmum and new mum in her 30s, just at the outbreak of the Second World War, must have been really, really difficult. My grandfather wasn't around a lot, and my mum was just a small baby, so my grandmother had a lot on her plate, and she was pretty much doing it on her own. It was a good job. She was thrifty and practical, and I think that helped my grandmother get through those very difficult times. Also, my grandfather wasn't the easiest person to live with, and I think a lot of the time my nan took the brunt of his anger and frustration. And I don't think she ever forgot her poor beginnings in life, because she was always squirreling food away. She was always very careful with her money, although she never understood when we changed from the old shillings and pence into decimal. My grandmother just could not grasp that for the life of her, and right up until the day she died, she still counted everything in old money. And not having a very good education and leaving school at 14, she did used to get her words muddled up, and we did used to sort of laugh at her. She was very much a Mrs. Malaprop, would get her words muddled up, which we always used to find hilarious. And she said she could never help it, but it was something that we loved about my grandmother. And like I say, if it wasn't for her, I wouldn't have had half the stories that I needed to write my book. So I do have to thank my grandmother. All those times she sat and chatted to me, they were so worthwhile, and I could never thank her enough for all the times that she told me about her family and her brothers and sisters, and what life was like growing up in the East End, because I really treasure those stories now, and I think she would be really happy that they're all written down in a book for her great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren, and any children that follow in the future. I think she would be absolutely chuffed by that, my grandmother.